The Vietnam War 1954 to 1975. This event was a disaster for the USA. The Viet Minh declared Vietnam independent. Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. The USA got involved in Vietnam because the US didn't want the whole Vietnam to become communist, so the domino theory wouldn't start. They had to use containment. Vietnam is a strategic position in the Cold War. Leaders: USA. Eisenhower provided support for the South Vietnamese government in the form of money, weapons and military leaders. JFK increased aid as South Vietnam was under attack from the Viet Cong. By the time JFK died, there were 16,000 US military leaders in Vietnam. Johnson. From 1964 onwards, the US sent massive numbers of US troops in Vietnam. He was very unpopular. By 1968, there were 500,000 troops in Vietnam. Nixon introduced the policy of Vietnamization. He wanted peace with honor. Vietnam. North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh. He was in charge of the Viet Minh and was also a communist. Supported the Viet Cong in South Vietnam and wanted to reunite the country as one. South Vietnam. Diem. He was an anti-communist and his regime was brutal and corrupt. Majority of the population was Buddhist, but Diem was out of touch. This gave the Viet Cong more support. He was overthrown and killed in November 1963. The Tonkin Resolution. In August 1964, North Vietnam attacked a US destroyer ship, the USS Maddox, in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson, US President at the time, thought this gave the US an opportunity to attack Vietnam. The US Congress passed the Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the President to fight a war as he saw fit. Over the next 3 years, he sent in troops and US Air Force using Rolling Thunder and Agent Orange. This burned away foliage and let Air Force see where they needed to attack, but this caused deforestation and killed thousands of innocent civilians. US difficulties. Even though the USA had 500,000 troops in Vietnam by 1968, they still had huge difficulties and could not win the war. The Viet Cong were numerically inferior, less equipped, and only received limited support from China and the USSR. Reasons for difficulties. The Vietnamese already had experience of defeating foreign armies such as the French and the Japanese. The US army was mainly made up of inexperienced soldiers. Moreover, it was fighting an enemy that used guerrilla tactics, dressed in the same way as the Vietnamese peasantry, and knew the country well. The Viet Cong developed a vast underground network. The Vietnamese had no reason to support the USA. The My Lao Massacre, March 1968, nearly 350 Vietnamese villagers were killed by US troops. These villagers were innocent. The Tet Offense. Viet Cong troops got as far as the South's capital, Saigon, before they were driven back. The Tet Offense was a failure but had a huge political impact. Americans felt that they could not win the war after this. Americans' reactions. They felt that they could not win the war. More Americans were being drafted and more body bags were being brought home. There was complaints about the cost of the war. Student protest against the US government's policies. There was burnings of draft cards. President Johnson did not go for re-election in 1968. National Guard killed 4 student protesters. Nixon. Nixon was determined to remove the USA from Vietnam. Nixon did not want the USA to look like they had lost. Secret bombing raids against Cambodia and Laos in 1970. They were the Viet Cong routes. 10 million tons of bombs were dropped by the US on Vietnam. Nixon introduced policy of Vietnamization. By this, US troops would withdraw from the south and the South Vietnamese forces would do the fighting. Peace talks. 1973, peace treaty signed in Paris. There was the withdrawal of the US forces and the return of the US prisoners of war. The Viet Cong was to remain in the south and to put off the country's political future until a later date. Nixon felt that he had received peace with honour. 1975, all of Vietnam was in communist hands. The US's involvement seemed to achieve very little. The results of the war. Huge military and civilian losses. Many US veterans suffered severe mental damage as a result of their experience in Vietnam. Vietnam was devastated by war economically, socially, and geographically. Cambodia and Laos also became communist. Policy of containment failed and the domino theory was becoming true. USA spent at least $120 billion on the war. The war proved that an enemy using suitable tactics could humble the USA. It was nowhere near a success for the USA. The USA had lost the war and lost 58,133 troops and 300,000 wounded. Containment had failed and the domino theory was becoming true. The Vietnam War was an epic failure for the USA.